Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this very special event of the Australian Institute of International Affairs Queensland branch. My name is Graham Kerridge, and I'm the Secretary of the AIIA Queensland branch. Now, we are very privileged to be having this event on the premises of Thomson Gear, who have very kindly made these delightful premises available to us to hold this event tonight. So we are immensely grateful. So thank you, Rachel. And we're also grateful for Griffith University for sponsoring the event. And Caitlin Byrne is here. So I will give you a quick word before I ramble on anymore.
Okay, thank you, Graham. The sponsor's position, I think, is a good one. Look, where should I go?
Here.
Yeah. Thank you. What a delight it is to be here and to see so many familiar faces, including from Jakarta and across Indonesia, and to all our friends who are joining us this evening. Welcome, it's wonderful to see you. I would like to take just a few minutes to say what a special privilege it is to be here at this particular lecture to be delivered by Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer. There is probably no one better to be recognised by the Australian Institute for International Affairs than Sue. And many of you wouldn't know, but I first began working with Sue more than 30 years ago, and we both worked in the International Legal Division of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. In those days, I was a junior lawyer. I was very green, very uncertain of myself, and Sue came into this world as someone who was also, we were similar ages, and we still are similar ages, young, vibrant, dynamic, incredibly passionate about the world that we live in. Not just passionate, but cares so deeply about the world we live in, about the justice that she sees in the world and a sense of fairness and equity. And so I just wanted to say it was a real delight for me. 30 plus years later, our paths have crossed on many occasions, but it's been a real delight for me to work more recently at Griffith University with Sue as the leader of our Policy Innovation Hub, as an outstanding international lawyer and professor in the field, and as someone who really cares about and gives back to her community very locally, but also on a global scale. I know her leadership through the W20, through the development world in ACFID, through the UN Association, and so many, many more circles of influence has had a real impact. And so it was a real pleasure, Graham. Thank you for letting me say something. It's a real pleasure to stand here today and to continue to listen to Sue, to learn from Sue, and to see her impact continuing. Thank you.
And I too would like to pay a special welcome to all of the group from Indonesia. Many of us here have worked or lived in Indonesia at times, and we've grown to be very fond of the people, the culture, and the community. So welcome. And finally, before I introduce Professor Susan, I do want to make a very special acknowledgement for here in Australia. We acknowledge that we are on the land of the Yagara and Turrbal people who have been here for millennia, and that this place has been a place of a discussion and storytelling for millennia. And so we pay our respects to the Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging. So tonight's talk will be by Professor Susan Harris-Rimmer, titled Multilateralism in Peril, Implications for Australia. Now, Professor Susan has focused on international human rights law, climate justice, national security, foreign policy, and gender equality in the Griffith University Law School, and she leads the climate justice theme at the Griffith Climate Action Beacon. Sue was previously the advocacy lead for the Australian Council of International Development and she's also worked at the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the National Council of Churches, and the Parliamentary Library. Susan was named a Fellow of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in 2024 and a Fellow of the Queensland Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2025. So she's been very busy. Tonight, we're privileged to have Susan giving her Fellow's address. When Susan and I first started planning this talk at the beginning of the year, we identified that, particularly given Susan's work for UNHCR, a talk recognising the 80th anniversary of the UN would be very relevant. As the year progressed, it became even more relevant and critical for all of us, particularly those of us in middle power countries like Indonesia and Australia, who rely on a world based on respect and a world based on the rule of law rather than on crude military power. So Susan will talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will have the opportunity for questions from the floor. We will finish at 7 p.m. So please welcome Professor Susan Harris-Orine.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Selamat malam. It's so nice. It's absolutely delightful to have my Indonesian friends here, and I welcome everyone who's come from Griffith University, at the UN community, the UN Association of Queensland, colleagues from the Queensland Government and the Federal Government. You're all very welcome. I'm very privileged to have you come and hear me talk today. I would also like to pay my respects to First Nations Australians. I pay my respects to elders, anyone online or here in the audience, of the Jagera and Turrbal Nations. But I also want to pay my particular respects to those First Nations Australians who've played such an important part in building the multilateral system through the establishment of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples, the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and many other parts of the UN. I am always inspired by the work of my colleague Megan Davis, who's from Queensland, and Les Mauser, who I grew up idolising for his advocacy skills, and the contribution of First Nations Australians to international affairs in Australia is very, very important. So I'm going to be really depressing tonight, and I'm so sorry, but I'm using this speech as a cathartic way of making you all as depressed as I am about the state of the world. I think it's very important for us to actually, on the UN's 80th birthday, to sit and take stock at an age when many of us in human years would feel venerable and respected and should be given you know, a kind of a feeling of a life well lived. The UN is in fact instead under siege and fighting for survival in many ways, both in terms of finances, but also more importantly in terms of mandates. So there's also some alternatives to the UN system. So we're interested tonight in multilateralism itself, not just the UN system. So we're interested in seeing what other types of configurations are emerging. And we have to always think about what are the implications for Australia and other middle power countries as this goes on. So let's crack on. This is what the talk will look like. I'm so sorry, I am a university professor, so there will be structure and there will be questions and there will be exams. Yes. Can't help myself. And first, there will be definitions. So multilateralism, what is it exactly? So if we think about the leading multilateral scholar in the world is the beautiful Joseph Nye, who passed recently. He said multilateralism was basically any grouping of 3 or more countries who use diplomatic efforts to pursue a common goal, to share resources and solve collective problems, often cross-border problems. And his particular interest was also how they can share burdens, so that the multilateral system, as he saw it, was one of sharing burdens. So we'll talk a little bit about that kind of vision of multilateralism. The opposite, of course, is unilateralism, where countries go it alone. I'll leave that there for the moment. I'm coming to that. And also there are the techniques of bilateral negotiations, country to country, and also an increasing interest in minilateralism. There's quite a few books coming out at the moment about minilateralism. That's very small groups of countries who can be quite nimble. The Quad is an example of that. MICTA, Mexico, Indonesia, Korea, Turkey, Australia is an example of that. All right, so we're going to talk about 3 key challenges for the UN. We're going to talk about 3 key strengths of the UN.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's all right, welcome, please.
Better late than never, they say.
That's all right.
Yeah, good evening, everybody.
So this is the structure of the talk. We're also going to look at some key strengths of the UN that it still retains, even with all the challenges. And we're going to talk about challenges in the multilateral system, including BRICS and majority countries. And then we're going to think some deeply about implications for Australia, and I really welcome a lively discussion about that at the end. And as I said, there will be an exam. Right. So just want to take you back to what it took to get the United Nations. All right, I just want you to remember what was happening with those 50 countries that signed the Charter in 1945 in San Francisco. So you remember there was World War I, there was the League of Nations, which failed to stop Japanese and Italian invasions. The US never joined the League of Nations. Britain and France fought all the way through it, and eventually it was abolished. It sort of just disintegrated, and World War II broke out. World War II, the largest destructive situation the world has ever known, the Holocaust, the first use of nuclear weapons, and huge displacement of people, right? So it took a lot of effort to get to these simple statements. And at first, the great powers, as they were then, were meeting at Dumbarton Oaks, and they were meeting at Yatala to carve up the world between them and to decide how to rule the new domain, carving up borders and so forth. But in San Francisco, there was a collective of smaller nations who said, no, we will not let the UN, as it will be called, the United Nations, be a vehicle for great powers. We will actually make sure that there's a lot in there for smaller and middle powers. And that block was led in the San Francisco negotiations by an Australian, by a man called Doc Evatt. If you haven't come across Herbert Evatt, he was a very indefatigable negotiator. He opposed the veto power for the permanent members very avidly, and he lost that fight. But he won the fight to get a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He won the fight for the UN General Assembly to have a significant array of powers and some of the funding powers in the Fifth Committee, which proved to be very important. But he also was the main instigator of the Palestinian-Israel partition, which has led to a lot of problems, as we know. So, but he's a very important figure in Australia, and most Australians have never heard of him. So it's very depressing to me. But this idea that the UN is for to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental rights and the dignity and worth of the human person, to establish conditions under which justice and respect for obligations arising for treaties and international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, which is a really beautiful phrase. That's what the UN stands for, and that's the beginning of the UN Charter. All right. So 80 years later, where are we? Okay. So the main challenges, in my view, are what they call the liquidity crisis that the UN is going through at the moment, which is a range of issues all happening at once to the UN. Issues to do with the Charter. So, in other words, countries who are violating the mandate of the UN around the crime of aggression and territorial invasions, for example, the crime of genocide and so forth, with seeming impunity. And the climate crisis, which the UN was not really set up to deal with in the sense of a novel set of needs that the UN's trying to deal with at the moment. So let's have a think about the liquidity crisis. This is a very simple idea. The US was capped. The US, of course, was the largest country in the post-war era. The US was capped in its contributions to 22%. That is still a very large amount of the UN budget. That's the purple one here. This is Japan, South Korea. This is China, and you can see China is rapidly becoming one of the largest donors on its own. Blue over here is the whole EU. And we're in here, in this green part, the Commonwealth of Nations, we're 2% of that green part here. And so you can see the majority of people live in the rest of the world there, right? A lot live in China, sure, a lot live in India, but, you know, this is the whole rest of the world are in this little 2% bottle here. All right, so what's happened is the UN works in, its budget works in very weird ways, but essentially there are assessed contributions, which is based on your GDP, your population. These are the assessed contributions. As I said, the US is the largest as a single country. And then there's voluntary contributions, of which the US has always been the largest and is actually much larger than its assessed contributions. So that means the country can decide to give the UN certain amounts of money. So Australia's always been a big supporter of the peacekeeping efforts of the UN, for example. So we give voluntary contributions to those parts of the system that deal with peacekeeping, or the humanitarian actors, those parts of the UN, for example. So what happened this year that has thrown the UN into a huge disarray? The UN has always had problems with budgeting. When I was at UNHCR, every now and then the lights would just go out, the indoor plants would go, and no one would be paid, right, on a very regular basis. So we've always had issues with budgets, right? Because countries pay late and they don't roll over their contributions. So it causes chaos. But this year, the US has decided not to pay its assessed contributions at all. China has paid its contribution very, very late, and the majority of countries have been very, very late. And so you'll see the US going from 500 million to 20%, the UN has contracted by 30% to $500 million budget and 20% less staff. So a huge contraction in what has happened over a very short period of time, at a time when the UN is also trying to reform as part of the Summit of the Future. But it's not just, as I said, it's not just the money, it's also the charter principles. So we have Russia invading the Ukraine, which is a very 19th century phenomenon, really. The sort of phenomenon that would have been very familiar to the creators of the League of Nations without the ability of the Security Council to really deal with that, because Russia has the veto power as a permanent member. But it's not because the UN is not needed anymore. So this staggering figure, 114.4 million people on the planet at the moment with life-threatening needs that are at the moment under UN mandates of some sort. 114.4 million people on the planet. And at the same time as all this is happening, the UN is also trying to deal with the new phenomena of the climate crisis. So let's talk about the big red elephant in the room, the Republican elephant I'm talking about. So as I said, it's not just that the US has always been a very large contributor to the UN, and there's always been tension around that contribution. But it really has been the bulk of humanitarian funding, for example, for a long period of time. But it's gone from 1.5 billion to 300 million this year. Now that hurts. That's got to hurt. And at the same time, the US has been reviewing its decision to be involved or a member of a range of UN organisations. So it's withdrawn from UNESCO, WHO, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNRWA, and the Human Rights Council. It's withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, ended funding to UNFPA, and has reduced its funding by 90% to the World Food Programme. It's imposed personal sanctions on the International Criminal Court prosecution staff, including the prosecutor himself, but also the Special Rapporteur on Palestinian Territories, Francesco Albanese. They have opposed, the US has a really very skilled diplomatic corps, you've probably seen them in action, and they have brought all those resources to oppose references to climate change, diversity and inclusion in all multilateral fora, including, I have heard, biodiversity, but I don't know whether that's real or not. And they have denounced the 2032 Sustainable Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is the most recent unanimous agreed state position around development. In his recent UN General Assembly speech, Mr. Trump resorted to pretty what we would have called unparliamentary language in the past, undiplomatic language around what the value he thought the UN had and what he thought of the 193 leaders in front of him when he said, "Your countries are going to hell," which no one has ever heard. There's been a lot of salty language in the UN General Assembly, but that's new. And at the same time, USAID was very rapidly dismantled, and USAID was of itself an incredibly important actor in our region in particular. He's also mentioned that he might be throwing out the World Bank and the IMF from their very lucrative real estate in Washington, DC. I don't know whether this is real or not, but a lot of UN agencies are leaving America, but it's more a budget decision. They're moving to cheaper capitals, particularly Nairobi and others. So that's a lot, and that's happened in a 12-month period. A lot of that was quite predictable. Some of it wasn't, though. I never thought, the US has never joined the International Criminal Court. It's never been a signatory to the Rome Statute. Nothing new there. Past the American Servicemen's Act, which we like to refer in international criminal law terms as the Hague Invasion Act, because it actually allows the US to go into The Hague and remove American servicemen from the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. And that was in the 80s. So they've always had a pretty difficult relationship with the International Criminal Court. But personal sanctions on the staff is a whole new ballgame. And this is the Palais de Wilson. This is the home of the United Nations, the League of Nations. It now houses the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And when I was in Geneva, I found out that due to budgetary circumstances, the UN can no longer look after this building and stay in this building. And that really hurt my heart. So, you know, the kind of the birthplace of multilateralism is going to be lost, and the Swiss government does not know what to do with that. So here is the Secretary General. Our Portuguese colleague is here, the consul. He is a Portuguese national. He has been an extremely strong Secretary General of the UN, and he is having thoughts, many thoughts about the state of the UN. So he's launched a very ambitious reform project, and he's trying within the new budget that he has to try to make the UN more effective. So he's reduced the work of the UN back to its three main pillars under the Charter, that of peace, development and human rights. He's merging many of the agencies and, as I said, moving them. So these are the armed conflicts in which the mandate of the UN has been severely challenged. And for a lot of the history of the UN, it has done very badly with proxy conflicts and non-international armed conflicts, but it managed to keep most international armed conflicts at bay, except for Korea, of course, the Korean War. But if you look at this record, these are all very protracted conflicts and very difficult conflicts, and the majority of them over 10 or 20 years of conflict. And some of them, including the Sudan, which never gets enough attention, the worst conflict the planet's ever seen, and yet no one seems to care about the Sudan in the way that they should. And some of these, as you can see, are international armed conflict, like Ukraine. Israel is not. Israel is an occupying power, but that might change if Palestine is recognised as a full member of the UN. So basically, the whole point of the UN is to stop international armed conflict and to stop within non-international armed conflicts them becoming genocides or, basically trying to put limitations on what can happen in that armed conflict. None of that has occurred in Gaza, so we haven't been able to ensure humanitarian access. There is now the International Court of Justice is determining whether or not there is a genocide taking place in that territory. It's yet to have final findings, but it's issued an interim finding that says there is evidence of genocide, and there's certainly evidence of war crimes on both sides between Hamas and the IDF, which have resulted in indictments by the International Criminal Court. The other conflict which has reduced people's faith in the ability of the UN to maintain its mandate in the Security Council is the Ukraine. Russia has used its veto power, the US used its veto power for Israel, and Russia has used its veto power for the Ukraine, so that the Security Council, if you look at the minutes of the Security Council for the last 5 years, you wouldn't know these conflicts exist. All the discussions about them are in the General Assembly because they keep being vetoed in the Security Council. So there we have the absolute raison d'etre of the UN, which is to prevent one larger country invading a smaller country. And that is the paradigm which the UN has not been able to deal with effectively in this decade. All right, so what's new is also the climate crisis. So the UNFCCC processes have been going for nearly 30 years, actually. We're about up to COP30 is about to begin in Brazil. That means there's been 30 years of these meetings, people. And it was only last year that we finally got agreement that fossil fuels will need to be phased out if we're going to reach net zero. At last, can you believe it took 30 years to get that agreement in a declaration of a COP? So now we're in this situation where the WMO are predicting overshoot. So what this means is all the climate scientists have been basically saying we need to get to 1.5. 1.5 is where terrible damage happens to us. And now the scientific community has said we are now locked into 1.5. We are going to overshoot that target. Australia reached 1.5 last year. So, you know, we're not looking at future here. We're looking at now. So they're thinking of some time between 2025 and 2029, we'll have overshot the 1.5 target. So that means adaptation strategies become very urgent, but also the UN has to show that it can solve this collective problem of bringing nations together to reach that 1.5. So now the scientists are talking about what happens if the overshoot lasts for more than a decade. They're also now really talking seriously about geoengineering stratospheric interventions, which are really dangerous and scary and unpredictable, right? This is where you shoot things into the atmosphere and hope that it removes carbon. The other issue that we've had is the planetary boundaries being breached, which I'll talk about a bit more, and we're starting to get heavy mortality. So the highest mortality from climate change is deaths from extreme heat events, and we were able to finally attribute causation for deaths in Europe last year, 16,500 extra deaths due to heat waves in Europe. That's just Europe. You know, they have the best data, but probably many of you know that it's been very, very difficult in many other areas of the world, particularly Pakistan and India, but the south of Europe has really suffered. And Australia is about to go in to a really flippity hot summer, and poor old Birdsville had its hottest day ever in October yesterday at 45 degrees. So this is why every 100th of a degree is very, very important to those negotiating these outcomes, because the difference in planetary temperature is a lot like the difference in the human body. If you run a fever, the longer you run a fever, the more damage it does to your body, right? It's very similar for the planet. So we're really looking at the types of agreements, but this is where we are at the moment. If we're the most optimistic, we're looking at 2.3. But if this is where we are, then we're in all kinds of trouble. And only a few countries, I think Germany and China, have finally started to go down in terms of carbon emissions. And of course, there's a range of justice issues around that. These are planetary boundaries. This tipped over this year. The ocean acidification just tipped over this week. So now the green space is where we want to be. And we have two in the green space: stratospheric ozone depletion and atmospheric aerosol loading. And that is because all of the work that multilateral institutions did to stop the hole in the ozone layer when we were young, right? In the 80s, in the 90s. So it is definitely possible. That is a multilateral success story. But all the rest of it, not so much. So this is basically, when they say planetary boundaries, they mean the conditions for the planet to be able to sustain human life and other species. So not looking great. Right, so depressed you enough, let's look at the happy stuff. Okay, so happy stuff, here's my happy place, Professor Hilary Charlesworth, our judge on the ICJ, amazing person, incredible human being. So there you go, if there's only one good thing, that's it. But there are some really good things that are happening, right? We have the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council are getting very good at bypassing a dysfunctional Security Council. So they have created now these independent investigative mechanisms, including Afghanistan just this week, for Iraq, Syria, Myanmar and Afghanistan. It's not the same as what the Security Council can do in terms of sanctions, but it does preserve evidence and it opens and keeps that space for justice in the future. And it's really important to see the General Assembly, you know, basically using its processes the way it can to come to quite an interesting range of outcomes that were never envisaged, I think, at the time of the design of the UN. They're also still, the UN's still engaging in treaty making, including the pandemic treaty, which was just completed, and thank heavens, because there's probably going to be another one soon, I'm afraid, folks. They're also working on the Convention on the Rights of Older People, the Elders Convention, which is currently being drafted in Geneva. As I said, the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have been criticised for a long time as not being effective. States were unwilling to take other states, drag them in front of the court. Well, that's gone. So we've had the Gabon taking Myanmar to the International Criminal Court. We've had South Africa taking Israel to the International Criminal Court. Australia has combined with 4 other states to take the Taliban to the International Criminal Court for crimes against women. So that's the way those courts are meant to operate, and we're finally getting to that period. The International Criminal Court issued this year indictments on Putin, on Netanyahu and senior Hamas leaders, on Duterte's, on very senior heads of state of important countries, and countries, you know, leaders who are still in power, which is very difficult, a very difficult political realm in which the court to act. But it's been 30 odd years and they've only done that in Africa so far, and African nations are getting fairly sick of that. So I think it's much better. This is the way the court was meant to work. It was meant to be, you know, impartial in its way that it deals out justice. So we'll see how they go in terms of those indictments. As I've said, Guterres has provided really good normative leadership. You should look at his speeches. They're beautiful. The speech he made during COVID was beautiful. He was the one who said, yes, we're all in this together, but some of us are on a super yacht and some of us are holding on to flotsam and jetsam. You know, that's what COVID is like. It's the same virus, but we're in very different situations in terms of equity. And that was a really important thing for him to have said at the time that he said it. Volker Turk, who's the High Commissioner for Human Rights, is trying his absolute darndest to keep standards as impartial and high as possible across the world. And there's a series of really impressive special rapporteurs, really worth the money because we don't pay them any money. These are volunteers who basically give up their lives to go around the world doing independent work for the UN, including Francesca Albanese, who you've all probably heard on the news talking about Palestine, Richard Bennett from New Zealand, who has been indefatigable on the rights of people in Afghanistan, Olivia De Schutter, who's been amazing on extreme poverty, and 2 wonderful Australians, Alice Edwards and Ben Saul, who are special rapporteurs on torture and terrorism. So there are many bright spots, and the brightest spot for me was the advisory opinion of the ICJ on climate obligations of states. This was brought by a series of law students from the University of South Pacific who worked with their governments to finally convince the world that there should be an ICJ advisory opinion, and got that to happen. And it's a really useful opinion. It followed the Inter-American Court of Human Rights opinion and the UN, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, ICLOS opinion on the law of the sea. So we now have a really strong set of ideas about how the world can cope with climate change whilst keeping justice at the heart of that response. Not bad for a group of law students. I met one of them in New Zealand recently and I gave her a very large hug. She has definitely been the bright spot of my year. So this, I just want to before we turn to the BRICS, I want you to start thinking about some of Guterres' words there. He really is talking about, from his history as Portuguese leader, he's saying multipolarity without effective multilateral institutions courts chaos as Europe learned the hard way, resulting in World War I. If you look at the multilateral literature, it's full of people talking about how similar this era feels to the 1930s. So I think our challenge, as I put in our special issue journal, our challenge is to not be that generation that future generations look back on and say, why did they let the League of Nations fail? Why did that group of people not invest in cooperation at that point in history? We don't want to be those people in history. All right, so a quick note about the BRICS. Here's the BRICS, very gender balanced group, as you can see. This was the meeting in Russia, and the Secretary General of the UN actually went to this meeting. 10 members: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, the United Arab Emirates, and as of this year, Indonesia, who moved up from being a partner country. Big step for Indonesia. Before that, you used to always say, no, we're in ASEAN, we are the leaders of ASEAN, but and BRICS. Whoopsie. And if you can look at this group of the BRICS, some of these are Russian allies, very clearly Belarus, Uzbekistan, etc. Some of them are big African countries who don't have a say commensurate with their status in the world, like Nigeria, like Uganda, for example, like South Africa. There's countries like Cuba that are kind of outliers. But look at the countries from our region: Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia. These are really important countries to Australia. They're always also very important countries in Asia. And they have chosen to align themselves with BRICS for a range of reasons. And this is the cracker here. The collective share of population and GDP of the BRICS now surpasses the G7, right? So that gravity of money and power is shifting collectively. And what do they want? They want the UN to reform, and they want it to reform fast. They want Brazil and India to become permanent members of the Security Council. They want the World Bank and the IMF to reform, especially their voting rules. And they've wanted that as long as I've been alive. And I am not young. So this has been going very badly for a long time. They want currencies to be different. So the US dollar as the currency standard causes a lot of problems for a lot of majority countries. They want a rejection of sanctions. This is very Russia and China motivated. They don't want any sanctions that are human rights or otherwise placed on them. So yeah. This is what they passed at the most recent set of meetings. And you can see they're very different, you know. The elimination of socially determined diseases, they mean things like diabetes and those types of those types of diseases, global governance of AI, climate finance. They're basically building a range of alternative governance documents to those put out by the G7, for example, particularly. They see themselves as the antidote to the G7. That was the most recent meeting of the G20 in Brazil. So Brazil has hosted the G20, the BRICS, and is about to host the COP. These countries, Brazil, India, South Africa, they are becoming the heart of global governance very rapidly. All right, so what is the implications for Australia? One of those implications for me, which we've been much more focused on the BRICS and the governance arrangements that majority countries are creating for themselves. We want to win a Security Council bid. So Mr. Albanese made a really beautiful speech, I must say. I highly recommend. I've put the URL down here. It's a cracker. It's the best speech he's ever given. I don't know who wrote it for him, but kudos to them. It was great, and he delivered it really well. And it's full of Australian history, the history of Australia's engagement with multilateralism. And it's spooky. It's like Doc Evatt could have written it. It's really been a very consistent engagement with the UN over a long period of time. So, you know, this is not an arena for great powers to veto each other. This is a platform for middle powers and small nations to voice and achieve our aspirations. That has always been the Australian view of what multilateralism is about. We are hoping to host COP Adelaide. You know, that has not gone very well for us so far because Turkey is messing with us. But hopefully that will be announced in Brazil soon. Trade norms are really important to us. We are one of the most open economies in the world. We need trade laws to facilitate that. The law of the sea is very important to us. We're a big island and we need freedom of navigation. So often when we talk about the rules-based order, what we actually mean is freedom of navigation laws. And finally, this is the end of his speech. I thought it was very beautiful. I'll just let you have a look about that. This is how he described the value of the United Nations, and I can't put it any better. If there is no system, then smaller or weaker countries lose. Now, I often say to people, Australia's not the middle when it comes to our economic power. We are the 14th richest nation in the world. That's not the middle, right? In no language is that the middle, but we have a small population and a small military, so there's a range of measures that they use. But this idea that most of us who aren't China and the US or the EU as a bloc lose in a world where there's not strong multilateral organisations and rules-based institutions. And finally, Penny has a way of making it very clear. This was on the hop too. She was just, a journo was kind of grabbing her on the way out the door and said, what is Australia's national interest anyway? And she went, bam, it's not perfect, but we're a middle power and we want a world where disputes are settled by engagement and negotiation. You know, and we want norms and international tribunals. We don't want a world in which disputes are resolved by power alone, which is exactly how we began this conversation. So just to end with Doc Everett, that's him. Got to look him up. It's really cool. He basically said, and this is where the BRICS come in, the rules-based order has not, in fact, benefited a lot of members of the UN. A lot of members that are still struggling with colonial backgrounds or colonial transitions, with debt, with an unfair trade system and unfair migration rules. So really what the BRICS are bringing to life, which I think is very valid, is we need a system of economic justice on which to base our global governance norms. That is a very good lesson from the BRICS, but we don't want to throw out the lesson of human rights standards at the same time. So that's the problem. Also, you know, key members of the BRICS are not democracies. So that's a real problem, I think, in terms of where that might evolve. So we need to think about economic justice as underlying factor. So that's it from me. I'm looking forward to lots and lots of questions, including from those colleagues online. Oh, so many hands have just leaped up.
Thank you, Susan. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. We are very keen to have questions, and I can see you. Look, fantastic. Okay. Would you like to start off? Yes, please.
Thank you for the opportunity. My name is Lina. So I would like to ask, what do you think if there's a list of threat to the multilateralism? What do you think if it's actually the time for a change into the current multilateralism? Because for the current multilateralism, you let just one side to be the majority of part of the multilateralism. Now, when this one side is against all the rules of the multilateralism, like the other country can do anything. Like, so for example, like the tariff from the US, and it against all the WTO rule trades, it's against the multilateralism, and it seems like the many nations can't do anything about it. So what do you think if it's actually the time for the change of the current traditional multilateralism?
It's a cracker of a question. So that's always been the problem with the UN, is trying to keep the great powers on side whilst allowing middle powers to fulfill their aspirations. And so the trade-off was the veto. That was the trade-off that Dr. Everett had to live with in the end in order for the UN to exist. Now, if you think about who has that veto, the US, Russia, China, France and Britain, you wouldn't really be giving the veto power to France and Britain anymore, would you? And it doesn't, it's frozen in time, that particular system. And you also wouldn't be giving a permanent veto to a country that has completely and blatantly breached the UN Charter, like Russia, on at least 2 occasions. So this issue of how we reform the Security Council is such a live one, but it's deeper than that. You're talking about unilateral tariffs that go against the World Trade Organization rules, and they've completely ruined the appellate jurisdiction of the WTO, which means that decisions are made and they go nowhere because we don't have an appellate jurisdiction anymore. The US has never seen itself as bound by the UN. I must say, this is not a completely new Trump phenomenon. The US has always, as the only superpower for a very long time, pretty much done whatever it wants. And that is in relation to invasion of Iraq. It's never signed core treaties, never signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child, never signed the Convention on the Discrimination Against Women, never signed the International Criminal Court Rome Statute. But it has underwritten a lot of the UN, and I think that's what's changed. And also the system that was really designed by the US to be in its favour, essentially, the World Bank rules and the voting rules and all the rest of it. It was all sort of lined up to be in America's kind of favour. So what do you do when the superpower stops wanting that responsibility or is more interested in unilateralism? You either wait it out, which has happened in the past, and the rest of the world just takes a deep breath and waits it out, or you create a system that survives without the superpower. But it's a totally new situation because back then, 50 years ago and 80 years ago, there was only one superpower, and that's not the case anymore. China and India and other nations are rising. As I said, that group of BRICS countries are now richer than the G7, right? So, but that means that countries like yourselves and Indonesia have to get used to governing for others, which I think is very important in your role in ASEAN, but it's a big responsibility. The US, I think, can rightly say we have had this responsibility for world peace, the world's policeman, for so long, and it's exhausted us and has taken a lot of our money, has taken a lot of US soldiers' lives. There are a whole range of arguments that the US can give, which is why they didn't sign the Rome Statute, that are very valid, right? We are always being called upon to intervene in many places. We don't want to be subject to the same rules as everybody else because we're not in the same situation as everybody else. So it's about working through the arguments the US is making and trying to decide what is valid and works as a fair system going forward. But as I say, I just think it's going to be different because it was just the US was the only game in town, and now it's not. But in this interim period, it is absolutely tearing the UN apart. So if the rest of the nations don't fill the void, then we have a real problem, and which is exactly what happened with the League of Nations. So, if we want a more fair and more distributed global governance system, we have to start paying for it. Right? That's a big decision for most of us to make.
Right.
Susan, thank you for your wonderful talk, which I quite catch all of it. But I have a question from John Fowler online. John asks this: a common destabilizing factor cited in literature is the rise of populism and isolationist nationalist movements. How do you envision the existing multilateral architecture adapting to these socio-political movements?
Well, with huge difficulty. Thanks, John. Goodness me. So, not just the US, there's huge amounts of issues in many different countries in terms of, I think of Hungary, many countries, including some of our colleagues in Asia. Think about Duterte's during the war on drugs. That was a really serious authoritarian moment for the Philippines. And Myanmar, Sri Lanka's in the recent past. we have had some really difficult nationalist and populist regimes in our world. What I think is new and is very difficult, and what sort of distinguishes it from the sort of the rise of the Nazi movement and the rise of fascism in a lot of Europe, is this ability to use the internet to sow disinformation, the use of AI to create fake images. You know, there's just a huge amount more scope to sow discord than there used to be. And the way Russia can mess with even small countries' elections like ours has been quite astonishing in terms of the amount of sophistication they can put into discord and hacking and various other things. So it's on different fronts than it used to be. But the root causes of populism have never changed. Inequality, a feeling of grievance, a feeling of not being included in growth or futures, people feeling like they have no hope. That is something we can be more compassionate about, right? That feeling that leads people to populism, those feelings that lead young men online to those kind of wormholes of hate. We should have compassion for that, and we should be disrupting that feeling of disconnection, right? And we should be making sure those people feel connected to their community, not vilified for who they are or their religion or their skin colour or whatever else it is. So the more we focus on inequality and compassionate responses to grievance, the better we will be, I think. So it's a complicated one. We have to have our principles. We have to stand for things. We have to stand for human rights, integrity, anti-corruption, transparency. But we can also stand for compassionate responses to people who have a feeling of grievance. And that is probably where we haven't really hit the mark yet. And that is what's creating a lot of the issues in the US and other countries. So we have a lot of work to do, right? But happy, well-fed people don't join paramilitary groups.
All right. My name is Tri from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's such a privilege to finally hear your lecture here tonight. First of all, I would like to emphasize that I think Indonesia and Australia has the same view about multilateralism that we want to strengthen. That just now is kind of declining. But it is interesting also that you haven't mentioned about UN80 initiative launched by the UN Secretary General in March. This initiative has 3 work streams. First is improving the efficiencies and effectiveness of the UN, and then also mandate review and structural changes. I want to ask your thought about this. Is this initiative will it make the UN more agile in the future? With the background of your analysis about the future challenges in the world.
Yeah.
And then my second question, but there's an idea floating around between UN member states that because the new Secretary General will be elected soon, right?
Yes.
So there's an idea to have a woman in the chair to be elected. Would you agree on this? And because there's a thought that with I don't want to be sexist, but I think I agree with the view that with the woman approach on conflict issues, it has more beneficiary, more a comprehensive approach of thinking conflict in various areas. So putting a woman in UNSG chair, I think is a good idea. I need your view on this.
Sure. So when I skipped over it a little bit because of time, but this was meant to be me talking about the UN80 reforms. I think the problem with the UN80 reforms is that they're coming at a time of budget crisis. So for the staff and people inside the UN, it feels punitive, not efficient, right? So when I was in Geneva, something like 1 in every 4 UN employees had just lost their job. 1 in every 4. There were moving vans everywhere. People who had, been working for the UN for 25, 30 years for being kicked out of Switzerland with a month's notice. So it was, that might feel like reform, but to me, that was a lot of talent walking out the door at a time we can least, afford for that talent to be walking out the door. And it didn't feel like it was strategic either. It was because of the budget cuts. So I think Guterres is trying to make a strategic alignment, and the UN can always reform. There's a whole joke from people who work in the UN is that nothing in the UN ever dies. It just sort of stays, so there's all these little bits of the UN everywhere, there's a lot of overlapping mandates. There's a lot of weird bureaucracy that states have made through various reasons. So yes, there's lots of room for reform, and I think what he came up with was very reasonable, but it's coming at a time when he has no control over the budget and they can barely keep the lights on. So is that really reform when you've got a knife, when you've got a gun to your head and you're really in a position to reform? It's not a good situation for the UN to be in. Your second point about whether there should be a war, of course I think there should be. I'm part of the campaign to have a female Secretary General, but now I also am an avid fan of the work of Michelle Ryan at the ANU, and she's the person who came up with the idea of a glass cliff. So this is the idea that when something's going terribly wrong, that's when women get leadership opportunities because we don't want that leadership opportunity anymore, right? So they call it the glass cliff. She's gently pushed over, which is definitely, we've all can remember examples of that in the Vietnam exactly. But I feel like and you'll notice, not even very avid devotees of the UN have been sticking their paw in the air for the Secretary General this round. Usually it's a very sought after job and everyone's like, no way, who wants to deal with this mess? I think not. But there have been some female candidates who've put their hands in the air, and one of them is Michelle Bachelet, who was Defence Minister and Prime Minister in her country and a refugee in Australia from Chile. It would have to be somebody like that. It would have to be someone with serious stature, someone who's been a Prime Minister or a President who can command respect in their own right. It's not the time, I think, for someone who can't have a conversation in the same room as people like Trump and Putin. So it would have to be someone who's really at the top of their game. And I just don't think a lot of world leaders want that at the moment. So we'll see. It'll be very interesting. Mr. Rudd, I'm sure, will volunteer. But I think it's going to be very difficult for whoever takes that job. I don't think anyone's. It's not like it used to be. Everyone wanted to be Secretary General at the moment. Everyone's taking 3 steps rapidly backwards.
Now we've probably just got 2 minutes left, so a very, very quick question. Yes.
Thank you for starting my meeting. One of the participants, I want to hear about the continuation of the 2030 agenda. Because we know that the US under the progress, they definitely trying to avoid like the reference list about the gender, SDGs, and also the climate change. Do you think that in the absence of the great power leadership, about the future of the SDGs, 2030 or beyond agenda?
Yeah, I'm so old. I used to work on the Millennium Development Goals campaigns in the day. So that was the one before the SDGs, and the Sustainable Development Goals felt like this big step forward because it was both people and planet, brought together. I mean, a lot of the goals we're nowhere close to meeting, so that's something. But they have, I think, given us a focus point, as did the Millennium Development Goals. They helped us say this is what a good future for the planet looks like. This is what full human thriving looks like. It looks like great cities, beautiful, clean oceans, girls who go to school, people who are not corrupt and have strong, lead strong institutions. It's a very holistic set of targets, and it's positive, right? This is good. If we make progress towards this, we're on the right track, and it helps people in that way. I think it would be a great shame if we allowed one leader in one country, which even if it is the most powerful country, there's still one leader in one country, to dismantle what was a unanimous global decision So we should always review every piece of multilateral agenda, and if it still, we think, has value, then we should, strive for it still. And as I said, there's never been a time in history where one person in one country, not even Hitler, can bend the whole world to their will, right? We still have agency and capacity to resist. And I think in terms of Indonesia, Indonesia has been a leader in development thinking for so long. Like a lot of the way we think about sustainable development comes from Indonesia, comes from the Bangara Declaration, comes from, all the thinking of the Group of 77 all those years. So I particularly think it's important for Southeast Asia in particular to defend the right to development. It's really important. And it is seen countries like Indonesia and Vietnam change so incredibly over my lifetime. Incredible, right? So it's worked. It's lifted so many people out of poverty, that focus. So I believe in it still. So, what that's worth. I think where something has been agreed by 193 nations, we shouldn't let it be torn down by one person.
Well, thank you, Susan. I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Raymond Lee.
Hello, everyone, and everyone online. My name is Raymond He. I have the pleasure of being the president of the AIIA Queensland branch. Can I begin firstly tonight by thanking once again Susan Harris-Rimmer, FAIIA, for giving our speech tonight. Please join me in thanking that. Thank you for being for speaking tonight, and tonight being also the occasion of your fellows speech. We would like to award to you your fellows trophy. I would also, of course, like to thank our very generous hosts here today, Thompson Gear, Rachel Drew, who is a partner at Thompson Gear, for having us here today. Thank you very much, Rachel. Of course, must acknowledge Professor Caitlin Byrne from the Griffith University. Thank you for being here and for sponsoring our nibbles, which we're having after this. And of course, I'd like to say a very warm welcome to our guests here from the Australia Awards from Indonesia. Selamat datang di Brisbane. Excuse my pronunciation. We are very thrilled to have you here. We hope that you are enjoying your stay so far, and that you will use tonight's opportunity to network with some of our members and guests here, and to strengthen the ties that you have with our country. It is a very important one. As I mentioned before, there's a brief period after this. Can I invite you to stick around for a bit of networking, food, drinks, kindly sponsored by Griffith University. Thank you for coming here.